The gavel struck, and with it came a warning that no one saw coming. The sharp crack echoed across the hushed courtroom, bouncing off the marble walls like a thunderclap, pulling every set of eyes toward the bench. Cameras clicked in frantic rhythm, their shutters chasing the moment, capturing the judge's stare. Cold, measured, absolute. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Representative Jasmine Crockett," she began, drawing out the syllables as if savoring them, "this court is considering sanctions against you." The words cut through the air like a blade. A ripple of gasps surged through the gallery. Some leaned closer, others froze in disbelief, their faces etched with the thrill of witnessing history collide with theater. For many, this wasn't just a courtroom proceeding. It was a battle of wills, a clash between power and defiance, and the audience knew it. Crockett did not flinch. She did not plead. She sat upright, her posture unshaken, her hands folded neatly on the table before her. To the untrained eye, she was calm, almost serene, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Behind the stillness, there burned a storm, indignation laced with conviction, a fire that no robe or gavel could extinguish. The tension was alive, almost tangible. A single cough from the back of the room broke the silence, but even that seemed quickly swallowed by the atmosphere of anticipation. Reporters scribbled notes as if the ink itself might run out before the moment passed. Judge Howell's expression hardened, lips pressed into a thin line. To her, this was authority undisputed, power unquestioned. She looked down from the bench with the confidence of someone convinced that her word would stand unchallenged. Yet in the way Crockett's gaze locked onto hers, there was an unspoken promise. This would not end the way the judge expected. Every second stretched into eternity. The crowd waited for a reaction, a protest, a plea, perhaps even surrender. But Jasmine Crockett gave them none of it. Instead, she let the silence build, let the weight of Howell's words hang heavy in the air, until even the judge shifted ever so slightly in her seat. And then, with the faintest hint of a smile, Crockett drew in a breath. No one in that courtroom expected what she did next. To understand the electricity in that room, one had to look beyond the polished wood of the benches and the solemn black robe perched above them. This was not just a courtroom dispute. This was a collision of two worlds, two legacies, two visions of what America could be. On one side stood Judge Beryl Howell, a figure who had worn the authority of the bench for years, wielding the gavel like a weapon of certainty. On the other sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman lawmaker whose voice had begun to cut through the static of Washington with a clarity that made both allies and opponents pay attention. Crockett was more than a nameplate on Capitol Hill. She was a rising star, forged from grit, sharpened by experience, and propelled by the belief that politics was not meant to protect the powerful, but to uplift the people. She represented the kind of defiance that unnerves the establishment, a black woman, unafraid to call out hypocrisy, unafraid to show fire in her words, unafraid to occupy space that others thought belonged only to the privileged few. Every time she spoke, millions who felt unseen heard themselves in her cadence, and that is why this moment mattered. Because across from her sat Judge Howell, a symbol of entrenched authority. Howell had built a reputation as sharp, methodical, and unyielding, the kind of figure who carried herself with the gravity of someone who believed the law bent to her interpretation alone. In that room, the confrontation was not about a sanction. It was about who defines dignity, who defines power, and whether voices like Crockett's were allowed to exist in spaces long guarded by tradition and gatekeepers. The stakes stretched far beyond the courthouse walls. Outside, cameras broadcast every frame to a nation that had grown addicted to political theater. Social media hummed with speculation, hashtags already forming, memes preloaded, audiences hungry for a clip they could share, dissect, and immortalize. Commentators whispered about how this would play not only on tonight's news, but in the shaping of narratives for years to come. A sanction here would not merely bruise a career. It would send a signal that even the boldest newcomers could be silenced by the old guard. But that is precisely why tension pulsed through every moment. Crockett's supporters saw her as more than a politician. She was a vessel of resistance, a reminder that identity and pride were not liabilities, but strengths. To them, Howell's attempt to sanction her felt less like judicial procedure and more like an attack on every person who had ever been told to stay in their place. It was a warning cloaked in legal language, a threat to shrink back into silence. Yet Crockett did not shrink. She never had. Her entire rise was built on refusing to bow, on standing taller when others tried to push her down. That was why every eye lingered on her, waiting, wondering, because the courtroom wasn't just watching Jasmine Crockett. They were watching the idea of change itself, staring down a judge who embodied the certainty of the old order. The weight of the moment was clear. If Crockett faltered, it would be replayed as a cautionary tale. But if she stood firm, if she turned the sanction into defiance, then this clash would ripple far beyond that chamber. And as silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of cameras and the tightening of anticipation, the truth became unavoidable. This wasn't just a hearing. This was a battlefield of identity, of power, of America itself. What happened next would not stay confined to the record books. It would echo far beyond the courtroom. To understand why the sanction against Jasmine Crockett felt like more than a judicial reprimand, one has to understand the woman behind the gavel. Judge Beryl Howell was not a name unfamiliar to Washington. For decades, she had walked the marble, halls of power with a reputation carved from discipline and an almost theatrical certainty in her authority. She was the kind of figure who commanded silence the moment she entered a room, not because people respected her humanity, but because they feared the cold certainty she projected. Howell's career was marked by ambition and calculation. Rising through the ranks, she carried herself as a guardian of the system, a stalwart defender of order. To many, she was brilliant, precise, meticulous. But brilliance without humility can calcify into arrogance, and Howell seemed to wear that arrogance as comfortably as she wore the robe draped across her shoulders. Her words carried the weight of finality, as if argument itself had little purpose once she had spoken. She prided herself on being unbending, and to the old guard of Washington, that unbending nature was celebrated. She was seen as one of them, a protector of establishment norms, a steady hand who would ensure that institutions never bent too far toward disruption. But to those outside those circles, to those who had felt the sharp end of the system, her demeanor read differently. It read as coldness. It read as detachment. It read as elitism cloaked in the language of judicial integrity. Patterns emerged over time. Howell had a way of cutting down those who dared to bring passion into her courtroom, as though humanity itself was an intrusion into her pristine chamber of rules. She demanded deference, not dialogue. Those who dared to challenge her tone or question her motives often found themselves swiftly silenced. It wasn't that she believed the law spoke louder than people. It was that she believed she was the law, and perhaps that was her greatest flaw. Because when one believes the robe makes them untouchable, hypocrisy begins to creep in unnoticed. For Howell, the robe was not merely cloth. It was armor. It was shield and sword, proof and pretext. It allowed her to strike down with authority and protect herself from scrutiny. Her rulings, though wrapped in the careful language of legality, often seemed to reveal an instinct to protect the establishment, to preserve the very power structures that had elevated her. Whispers in Washington told of moments when her impartiality seemed clouded by her disdain for the brash and the outspoken. It wasn't that she bent openly to one party or another. It was subtler than that. It was in the way she regarded outsiders as irritants, how she tightened her jaw at defiance, how she wielded sanctions not just as corrections but as punishments. She did not simply interpret the law, she imposed her will through it. For years, this went largely unchallenged. Those who stood before her were often seasoned lawyers or cautious politicians who knew better than to poke the bear. They played by her rules, spoke with careful reverence, and walked away relieved to have survived her scrutiny. That was how Judge Howell maintained her aura, by ensuring the balance of fear always tipped in her favor. But Jasmine Crockett was different. She didn't come from the corridors of compromise. She didn't step into politics to preserve the status quo or flatter the establishment, and Howell knew it. From the moment Crockett's name landed on her docket, there was a tension, as if the judge had already decided that this rising star needed to be reminded of her place. It wasn't about the legal technicalities alone. It was about what Crockett represented, the very thing Howell had spent her career containing. Howell was old guard, polished, insulated by decades of power. Crockett was new blood, fiery, unapologetic, embodying the voices that Howell had long kept at the margins. In many ways, the sanction attempt was Howell's way of drawing a line. To her, it was a chance to show that even a rising congresswoman, even a voice as bold as Jasmine Crockett's, could be bent beneath the weight of the gavel. But beneath the surface of that gesture lay something more fragile: insecurity. Because every time Howell swung the gavel against passion, against identity, against the voices that refused to bow, she revealed not strength, but fear. Fear that her authority could one day crumble, and that was the unspoken irony. She believed the robe made her untouchable, yet the very act of trying to silence Crockett revealed cracks in her armor. By wielding her authority so aggressively, she risked showing the nation not the dignity of the bench, but the arrogance of the person behind it. In that courtroom, Howell thought she held all the cards, but the weight of her history, her patterns, her arrogance, it all set the stage for the moment she least expected. Because when arrogance meets defiance, power can shift in an instant. And the room was about to witness that shift. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin beneath the bright lights of a courtroom or in the heavy chambers of Congress. It began in the modest streets of St. Louis, where the sound of church bells and the hum of community anchored her childhood. She grew up in a world where resilience was not an option, but a requirement, where families stitched together dignity with what little they had, and where children like Jasmine learned early that life would not hand them opportunity. They would have to wrestle for it. Her parents instilled in her the kind of values that could not be bought or bartered. Work hard, tell the truth, stand tall, and never forget where you came from. Around the dinner table, those lessons were not abstract ideals, but survival tools. Her father often reminded her, if you don't speak up, someone else will speak for you, and they won't always speak with your best interest at heart. Jasmine absorbed those words like scripture, and they became the rhythm of her life. School was never easy, but she carried her grit like a shield. While others doubted her potential, she doubled down on her studies, refusing to let dismissive whispers define her. Her path to college and law school was not paved with privilege or legacy connections. It was carved out of late nights, relentless work, and the refusal to quit. Every loan form she signed, every hour she spent balancing work and study, every moment she fought to prove she belonged, built the resilience that now radiated from her in courtrooms and on the House floor. Law, for Jasmine, was not just a profession. It was a calling. She could have chosen lucrative paths, offices in skyscrapers, the quiet comfort of compromise. But she didn't. Instead, she returned home to practice as a public defender, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who could barely afford to dream of justice. She walked into courtrooms with clients who were invisible to the system, whose voices were ignored, whose humanity was often treated as disposable. And each time she rose to speak for them, she was reminded of her father's words. If you don't, speak up. Someone else will. That work hardened her. She knew what it meant to stare across the aisle at prosecutors who saw numbers, not lives. She knew what it felt like to argue before judges who looked at her clients as statistics, not sons, daughters, or parents. And she knew what it meant to lose, to feel the sting of injustice when the system devoured those who had no armor to protect themselves. Yet in that loss, she found her purpose, to keep fighting, to keep speaking, to keep showing up, no matter how many doors tried to close in her face. Politics came almost as a natural extension of that mission. Crockett understood that if the courtroom was a battlefield, the halls of Congress were the fortress. If she wanted to protect her community, if she wanted to change the outcomes for those she defended, she had to step inside the fortress and fight from within. And when she did, she carried not only her own story, but the stories of every client, every neighbor, every silenced voice that had been dismissed as unworthy of dignity. That is why her presence unnerves the establishment. She does not speak from theory or ideology, she speaks from lived struggle. Every word she utters carries the echo of her community, the memory of battles fought in courtrooms where the odds were stacked, and the knowledge that justice, real justice, is never handed over. It is demanded. Her colleagues in Congress quickly learned that Jasmine Crockett was not there to blend in. She was not there to become another anonymous seat, another compliant vote. She was there to shake walls, to hold mirrors, to remind America that power should not be the property of the privileged few. She carried herself with an authenticity that could not be manufactured, and that authenticity made her a target. For every admirer who saw courage, there was an opponent who saw a threat. But Jasmine never let the threat of backlash silence her. She had grown up in spaces where silence was survival, and she had chosen to break that mold. In every speech, every committee hearing, every confrontation, she embodied a larger truth. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every silenced voice. The single mother balancing 2 jobs, the young immigrant learning English while navigating prejudice, the working-class family priced out of health care, she carried them all with her. That is what made her so dangerous to the old guard. She could not be intimidated by titles or robes because she had already faced down the weight of systems designed to exclude her. She could not be silenced by threats of sanctions because she had lived her entire life resisting the demand to stay quiet. Every trial, every insult, every door slammed in her face had been training for this moment. And so, when Judge Howell raised her gavel and issued the threat of sanction, Jasmine Crockett did not tremble. She had walked into battles far harsher, faced odds far grimmer, and carried burdens far heavier. This was not just another confrontation. It was the culmination of everything she had been preparing for since the first time she stood up in defense of the voiceless. The courtroom saw a congresswoman sitting at a table waiting to speak. But what they were really seeing was a lifetime of struggle condensed into one unflinching presence. They were seeing the product of resilience, the embodiment of community, the face of resistance. And behind her calm exterior lay the fire of someone who had never once bowed to intimidation. What happened next would prove that the robe may give a judge authority, but it could never strip Jasmine Crockett of the courage that had carried her this far. The air inside the courtroom grew heavier with each passing second, as if even the oxygen understood the collision that was unfolding. Judge Howell's voice sliced through the silence once more, sharper this time, her cadence clipped and stern. Representative Crockett, your conduct cannot be ignored. This court demands respect. This court demands order. The words echoed. With the confidence of someone accustomed to submission, someone who expected the accused to bow, apologize, retreat. But Jasmine Crockett did none of those things. She sat perfectly still, her chin lifted just enough to convey quiet defiance, her hands resting loosely on the table as though she were not the one under threat, but the one waiting for the truth to reveal itself. To anyone else, Howell's tone would have been enough to rattle composure, but Jasmine had faced sharper tongues, more cutting tones, and harsher dismissals in her life. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strength, and it unnerved the judge. Howell's frustration seeped through the mask of professionalism. "You have shown disregard for this process," she pressed, her eyes narrowing. "Such behavior undermines the very institution you claim to serve." Each syllable was deliberate, a hammer striking down to remind the room that she held the gavel, she commanded the law. But for the first time that day, her voice carried a faint tremor. Not of fear, but of irritation. And irritation in a judge was dangerous. Jasmine finally spoke, her tone even, almost disarmingly calm. "With respect, Your Honor, I have shown nothing but commitment to the principles of justice. If raising concerns, if speaking truth is now considered misconduct, then perhaps the problem is not with my behavior, but with the expectations being imposed upon me." A murmur rippled through the room. Every ear leaned in closer. Every pen scratched harder across notepads. It was the kind of answer that didn't shout, but still shook. Howell's lips tightened, her gavel tapping once against the block as if to punctuate her control. "You will not lecture this court, Representative," she snapped. "You stand here to answer, not to redefine the rules." But Jasmine was unmoved. Her gaze locked on Howell's, unblinking, unshaken, as though daring the judge to attempt another blow. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was the posture of someone who understood the stakes were larger than herself. Every word Howell threw carried not just weight, but threat. And every pause from Jasmine felt like resistance, a refusal to surrender the dignity of her voice. The sparring intensified. Howell demanded, Crockett replied. "The judge accused," Crockett clarified. Back and forth it went, each exchange more charged than the last, like sparks dancing dangerously close to an open flame. The gallery sat frozen, their eyes darting between the bench and the table, as though watching a fuse burn slowly toward explosion. "Representative, you risk further sanction by continuing this charade," Howell said, her tone icy. "Sanction me for what?" Jasmine countered smoothly, her voice carrying across the chamber. "For standing firm? For not bowing my head when I've done nothing wrong? If the expectation is silence, then understand this. Silence is not my duty. My duty is to the truth." It was the kind of statement that left even seasoned reporters staring wide-eyed, their fingers briefly pausing above their keyboards. Howell's gavel struck again, but this time the sound rang hollow, as though the authority behind it was wavering. The judge's words came harsher now, her tone almost brittle. "You test the patience of this court." "And yet patience," Jasmine replied softly, "is exactly what the people I represent have been asked to endure for generations. How long must they wait? How long must we?" The silence that followed was not mere quiet. It was an earthquake held in suspension. For a flicker of a second, it seemed the entire courtroom was holding its breath, waiting to see if the foundation of authority itself would crack. Howell leaned forward, her jaw set, her robe shifting slightly as she prepared to reassert dominance. But before she could speak again, Jasmine did something no one expected. She leaned forward, too, closing the distance with deliberate calm. Her eyes locked even harder on Howell's, her voice dropping into a register that demanded attention without raising volume. Then Crockett leaned forward. And in that instant, everything shifted. When Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, the room seemed to tilt with her. The motion was subtle, but it carried a weight that instantly shifted the balance of power. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the table. Instead, she spoke with the steady calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Your Honor," she began, her tone smooth but edged with steel, "you accuse me of disrespect. But let us look at the facts." The crowd straightened in unison, like students leaning in for a lesson they knew would matter. Crockett slid a sheet of paper from the stack before her. On record, she continued, I have complied with every request, every deadline, every procedure asked of me. Not once have I disrupted this courtroom, not once have I treated the law as beneath me. Yet today, I stand accused of conduct so severe it warrants sanction. If that is not irony, then what is? A murmur rolled through the gallery, soft but undeniable. Judge Howell stiffened, fingers tightening against the gavel. Representative Crockett, she started, but Crockett didn't flinch. She raised a hand, ever so slightly, not to silence the judge, but to reclaim her space. Respectfully, Judge, let me finish. Because if we are truly talking about conduct, then perhaps we must widen the lens. Respect cannot mean silence. Respect cannot mean obedience without question. Respect must mean honesty, accountability, and truth, even when it is uncomfortable. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing her expression. Calm, unbroken, resolute. She leaned closer still, her voice carrying a moral clarity that filled every corner of the chamber. You claim I undermine this institution. But what undermines it more? A representative who dares to speak truth to power, or a court that punishes those who refuse to bow their heads? Gasps punctured the stillness. Even those who had come, prepared to remain neutral, felt the sting of her words. One reporter nearly dropped his pen, eyes darting from Crockett to the bench as if trying to reconcile what he had just heard. Howell shifted in her chair, the robe rustling as though even. The fabric felt the tension. She fumbled with a stack of papers, buying herself seconds, hoping the shuffling would mask her unease. But the audience saw it. They saw the judge rattled, and the more Howell tried to project composure, the more cracks appeared in her facade. Crockett pressed on, her words now steady beats in a rhythm that built toward crescendo. This is not the first time someone like me has been told to sit down. It is not the first time a woman of color has been called disruptive for raising her voice. It is not the first time a system has tried to make the truth sound like misconduct. But I promise you this, it will be the last time I accept it without challenge. The gallery erupted in hushed murmurs. A few clapped before quickly catching themselves, the sound swallowed by the marble acoustics. Howell's eyes darted toward the bailiff, but even he hesitated, unwilling to break the moment. Representative Crockett. Howell tried again, her tone strained. You are dangerously close. To what? Jasmine cut in, her tone unwavering. To refusing to bow? To insisting that dignity belongs to everyone, not just those in power? If that is the danger you fear, then I accept it gladly, because the people who sent me here did not choose me to play it safe. They chose me to speak when others are silent, to stand when others bow, to fight when others surrender. By now, the murmurs had become a current, flowing through every seat. One woman in the gallery whispered, "She's saying what we've all wanted to hear." Another man shook his head in awe, whispering, "She's fearless." Jasmine reached for another document, a transcript. She lifted it for all to see. "This," she said, "is the record of my statements, unedited. Every word rooted in fact, in law, in principle. If this is sanctionable, then perhaps the issue is not the words I've spoken, but the discomfort they cause. And discomfort, Your Honor, is not misconduct. It is the first step toward justice." The room fell so silent that even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. Howell's knuckles whitened against the bench, her mouth opening but no words emerging. She shuffled another stack of papers, but her movements betrayed her. The authority that once seemed untouchable now looked shaken, fragile, exposed. Jasmine's tone softened, though the strength behind it only grew. I respect this institution. I respect the law. But I will never mistake respect for submission. I will never confuse silence with integrity, and I will never allow a robe, no matter how heavy, to outweigh the truth. It was not just a defense, it was a declaration. Every syllable landed with precision, each phrase carefully woven into the next, building momentum until it was undeniable. The energy in the room shifted completely. No longer judge versus congresswoman, but arrogance crumbling before dignity. Reporters scribbled furiously, some abandoning their notepads to record on their phones. Social media managers in the back row typed with lightning speed, already pushing quotes out into the digital ether. Even those who had walked in skeptical felt the tide turning. Crockett was not merely surviving, she was winning. And then came the moment. The final strike, the blow no gavel could erase. Jasmine paused, letting the silence hang, drawing in a breath that seemed to carry generations of struggle with it. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, steadier, heavier with truth. History will not remember the sanction you threatened me with. It will not remember the robe you wore or the gavel you struck. It will remember that in this room, on this day, one woman stood unafraid to speak when silence was expected. And it will remember that justice does not tremble before intimidation. It stands taller because of it. The words settled like a storm breaking. Gasps, murmurs, a stifled cheer quickly hushed. Even the reporters, hardened by years of spectacle, could not disguise the awe in their faces. Judge Howell sat frozen, the gavel heavy in her hand but useless. No amount of striking could drown out what had just been spoken. And in that moment, as the echoes faded, the weight of her words became undeniable. The silence after her words was louder than any gavel. The silence in the courtroom didn't stay. Contained within those marble walls, it leaked out, first through hurried reporters rushing to the courthouse steps, then through buzzing phones, then through the endless scroll of social media feeds. Within minutes, the moment had been clipped, subtitled, shared, and reshared. The words that had hung in the air, "Justice does not tremble before intimidation," now flashed across millions of screens like a mantra. On Twitter, hashtags erupted in unison. Crockett unshaken. Truth to power. Silence is not respect. The tags trended within an hour, climbing past celebrity gossip and sports chatter, dominating the feed with a singular narrative. Jasmine Crockett had not only faced down Judge Beryl Howell, she had dismantled her. The clips spread with wildfire. Intensity. One 30-second highlight of Crockett raising her hand against the judge's interruption was retweeted tens of thousands of times, each caption carrying its own spin. "This is how you stand tall." Every voice silenced in America just found its echo. A mic drop for the history books. Commentators moved quickly. Cable news broke into live coverage with scrolling headlines. Crockett vs. Howell. Courtroom clash goes viral. On progressive platforms, anchors spoke with thinly veiled excitement. This wasn't just a hearing, one analyst declared. This was a turning point. Crockett reframed what it means to resist power, not through chaos, but through unshakable composure. Even mainstream pundits, normally hesitant to praise such open defiance in court, admitted something undeniable had occurred. "You don't have to agree with her politics to recognize the moment," one conservative commentator said grudgingly on a panel. It was raw, it was calculated, and it landed. Howell lost the room, and Crockett gained the country. Celebrities joined the chorus. An award-winning actress tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just showed every young girl watching that grace and fire can coexist. I'm floored." A Grammy-winning musician posted the viral clip with 3 words. "She's our voice." Activists and grassroots organizations pushed the story into movement territory, urging supporters to rally around what they called the Crockett Doctrine, the refusal to bow to intimidation cloaked in authority. The public didn't just watch, they participated. Crowds began gathering in city squares, holding handmade signs with Crockett's words scrawled across cardboard. One placard read, "Discomfort is the first step toward justice." Another, "Respect is not silence." It wasn't orchestrated, not by any campaign or committee. It was organic, born from a collective recognition that this one moment had tapped into something simmering beneath the surface. For countless people, especially those who had felt overlooked or dismissed by institutions of power, it wasn't just her win. It felt like a win for every citizen tired of arrogance sitting smugly in high places. Crockett's composure became a rallying cry, a blueprint for defiance that didn't descend into chaos, but instead rose above it. Meanwhile, Judge Howell's image shifted almost overnight. Clips of her shuffling papers, struggling to regain control, replayed alongside commentary that painted her as rattled, overconfident, even petty. Memes flooded Instagram. Howell clutching her gavel with captions like, "When the robe isn't enough," or "Power meets resistance." For a figure once draped in an aura of authority, the optics were devastating. The ripple effects extended into political spheres. Progressive leaders praised Crockett as a standard-bearer of courage. A senator tweeted, "What Jasmine Crockett did today wasn't just brave, it was necessary. The system doesn't change without voices willing to shake it." Civil rights organizations amplified her message, calling it a reminder that the fight against systemic intimidation was far from over. Even opponents, though critical, inadvertently amplified her visibility. Some accused her of disrespecting the court, others claimed she sought spectacle. But every criticism only fed the cycle. Every mention only ensured that her name stayed at the top of the conversation. In living rooms, cafes, and office break rooms, people debated the meaning of what had unfolded. Some said it was political theater. Others argued it was the purest act of accountability they had seen in years. But whether admired or critiqued, no one could deny its impact. Crockett had forced the country to watch, to discuss, to reckon with the imbalance of power she exposed, and so the moment grew beyond itself. It was no longer just a courtroom clash between a congresswoman and a judge. It became a cultural flashpoint, reshaping how both figures were seen. Howell, once respected, feared, and rarely questioned, was now cast as the emblem of brittle elitism, her authority undermined by her own faltering. Crockett, by contrast, emerged larger than the chamber that sought to contain her. To millions, she was the woman who proved that truth, spoken calmly but firmly, could shatter even the thickest veneer of untouchable power. And in that reshaping, a new question hovered across the nation. If one voice, steady and unbroken, could send such shockwaves, what might happen when millions found the courage to do the same? When the dust finally settled and the cameras shifted from frenzy to reflection, Jasmine Crockett refused to let the narrative stay small. She did not frame what happened as a personal triumph, nor as a headline-worthy sparring match between herself and Judge Howell. To her, it was never about the sanction, never about the robe, never even about her own reputation. It was about something larger, the soul of democracy and the promise that justice was meant to serve everyone, not just the few perched atop, the hierarchy. Standing before microphones in the hours after the confrontation, Crockett's voice carried the steadiness of someone who knew the weight of her words. "This was never about me," she began, her tone measured but resolute. "This was about what happens when those in power forget that their power is borrowed, that it comes from the people, not from themselves." She reframed the entire attack as proof of the struggle that defines the American experiment. The attempt to silence her, she said, was not unique. It was the same tactic wielded against workers demanding fair pay, against immigrants seeking dignity, against women, people of color, and every marginalized voice that had ever been told to wait their turn. Howell's gavel may have tried to reduce her to silence, but Crockett turned the attempt into a megaphone, amplifying the truth that dignity does not come from titles, and authority does not grant immunity from accountability. With rising intensity, she pressed the point that cut through partisan noise and spoke directly to the values of her audience. In America, the measure of our democracy isn't how we treat the powerful, it's how the powerful treat us. If a robe or an office can be used to diminish voices rather than protect them, then we have forgotten who we are supposed to be. The free crowd listening leaned in closer, not for spectacle, but for substance. Crockett's words were not crafted for sound bites alone. They carried the cadence of lived experience, of someone who had seen the sharp edge of injustice and still chose to stand taller. She reminded them that intimidation is the oldest tool of the privileged, but history, again and again, had proven that dignity outlasts fear. Her speech built like a crescendo, each line lifting the audience higher. I wasn't fighting for my seat. I was fighting for the teacher in Texas who feels unheard, for the immigrant family told they don't belong, for the young girl watching and wondering if she will ever be allowed to speak her truth without being told she's too loud, too bold, too much. I was fighting for every silenced voice, and let me tell you, silence will not win. In that moment, she shifted the focus away from the tension of the courtroom toward the enduring truth of collective strength. Because in America, she declared, her voice ringing like a bell, power bows to truth, not the other way around. The words landed like a final verdict, one not written into legal record, but etched into the memory of all who heard them. It was not defiance for the sake of drama. It was reclamation, the reminder that democracy was never designed to protect arrogance, but to uplift accountability. And that was the moral embedded in the moment. Dignity defeats intimidation, every time. Crockett's composure had not only exposed the brittleness of Howell's authority, it had also illuminated the resilience of justice itself. Where arrogance demanded obedience, dignity offered resistance. Where intimidation sought silence, truth found a voice. For those who watched from afar, the lesson was clear and stirring. Power without humility is fragile. Authority without respect is hollow. And intimidation, no matter how sharp, cannot stand against the steady force of dignity. As the headlines continued, as the hashtags thrived, what lingered most was not the clash, nor even the shock of the sanction. It was the vision Crockett painted, a vision in which ordinary people could look at themselves and see the capacity to resist, to stand, to demand better. The courtroom may have closed its doors that day, but what it left behind was not silence. It was an anthem, echoing through the nation. Dignity is stronger than fear, and truth will always outlast intimidation. The story began with the threat of a sanction, a strike of the gavel meant to shrink one woman into silence. But instead, that moment became something greater. What was intended as humiliation turned into revelation. In that room, arrogance fell silent, and courage spoke louder than the gavel. Judge Howell may have believed the robe was her shield, but Jasmine Crockett showed the nation that truth does not cower before titles. She transformed an attack into a moral victory, reminding every person watching that the strength of democracy isn't measured in punishments handed down from above, but in the resilience of those who refuse to be silenced below. The image of Crockett leaning forward, calm yet unyielding, will remain etched in memory not as a clash of personalities, but as a symbol of what it means to stand tall when power tries to press you down. Her words carried further than any ruling. Her composure resonated deeper than any command, and her courage offered a lesson America desperately needed to hear. Dignity will always outlast intimidation. This wasn't just one woman's defiance. It was a spark, a reminder that justice belongs to the people, and that every citizen has the right and the duty to demand better. And if arrogance can be challenged in that courtroom, it can be challenged anywhere. If you believe in standing tall against abuse of power, share this story. Subscribe and be part of the movement reminding America what justice truly looks like. Because this fight isn't over. And together, we ensure that the next time a gavel falls, it falls in service of truth, not in fear of it.